heat of argument, or something like that. So welcome all. And what is modern constitutionalism? So since I thought up this title, I guess I'm obliged to give some kind of immediate response. And you might well ask, what is modern constitutionalism? Constitutionalism has been defined by one prominent Canadian scholar as the view that government can and should be legally limited in its powers. And a glance at today's newspaper reveals that in many, if not most parts of the world, that view remains contentious. From China to the Middle East and Africa, the question of whether there is to be a government of laws or of men, as Aristotle almost put it, looms large. And yet to say a government of laws, not men, forces one to confront a crucial ambiguity, I think. Whose law, and by what authority, if not the government's? Owing partly to that ambiguity, the considered ancient view seems to have been that the regime or government, the actual rulers in charge of the way of life they represent, the politeia, is ultimately more important than any laws, however seemingly fundamental. During the early days of the Roman Empire, for example, the term constitutio, from which our word constitution is taken, referred to the 7 basic laws and ordinances issued by the emperor. No limited government there. And cleaving to that imperial tradition, the 1911 edition of the British Encyclopedia Britannica, defines a constitution as the rules laid down by the sovereign power. In short, the Constitution is what the sovereign says it is. The Bible, by way of contrast, seems to make God's law supreme over any merely human ruler. King David could no more abolish the laws of the Torah than today's Saudi monarchs, apparently, can suspend Sharia. Modern constitutionalism, the subject of today's panel, is different. Modern constitutionalism involves not only rule by law in the sense that the Hebrew Republic, as it's sometimes called, or the sort exhibited by today's Saudi monarchs might express, but rule under a set of laws whose authority lies elsewhere than the Bible or Quran. Consider as Exhibit A the Preamble to the U.S. Constitution, which opens with, "We the people," and ends with, "Do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States." At the same time, more is involved, it seems, in modern constitutionalism than merely the principle of popular sovereignty, but that's hardly a mere concession. So consider as Exhibit B another passage, this one roughly taken from the Declaration of Independence, which Lincoln once called the Constitution's golden frame. And this will be very familiar. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these being the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments are instituted among men to secure these rights. In sum, modern constitutionalism not only demands that government be authorized by popular consent, it also holds that such consent should be guided or informed by basic principles of right or justice, universally accessible as it seems to human reason. On this point, Thomas Hobbes and Immanuel Kant, among others, have much to say. Perhaps there will be time for me to comment on that later. What happens, though, when basic principles of right that supposedly are accessible to reason, for example, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and majority consent or popular sovereignty conflict? For the U.S., at least, it would take a very bloody civil war to resolve that issue, if it ever can be fully resolved. But the purpose of today's panel is to help reawaken a sense of how great and controversial an achievement modern constitutionalism, including but not limited to the form and body of the U.S. Constitution, really is. And we're extremely fortunate, really fortunate, to have with us a number of distinguished guides who will be sharing their thoughts in ways that fall in roughly, but only roughly, chronological order, from the ancient Greeks to more recent times. And just to introduce them to those of you who don't know them, Robert, beginning on my right, your left, Robert Bartlett. Rock is professor of Hellenic Political Studies and co-editor, most recently, of a really outstanding edition of Aristotle's Ethics, just out from the University of Chicago Press, and reviewed with some acclaim by the New York Times. He's currently at work on a book on Plato's Protagoras and Theaetetus. Robert Faulkner, professor of political science, whose public work ranges from, published work ranges from John Marshall to Machiavelli, Bacon, and Locke. And his most recent book is The Case for Greatness, Honorable Ambition and Its Critics, published recently by Yale University Press. He's currently writing on nobility. Actually, I am obliged to report that in typical nobly self-deprecating fashion, when this question, what are you working on, was put to him, his first reply was, nothing much. Noble self-deprecation in action. Nasser Benegar, also professor in the Department of Political Science, has published on modern social science, Shakespeare's politics, Islamic political thought, and other themes. He's the author of a highly regarded book on Max Weber and Leo Strauss, and currently working on an eagerly awaited book on Locke, whose working title I think is still Tough Liberals. Yeah. Harvey Mansfield is William R. Kennan, professor of government at Harvard University. He's the author of many path-breaking works, including among others, Statesmanship and Party Government, a study of Burke and Bolingbroke, and most famously, Taming the Prince, the Ambivalence of the Modern Executive Power. His most recent book, Tocqueville, A Very Short Introduction, co-authored with the late Delbert Winthrop, appeared in 2010. Christopher Kelly, professor of political science, is the author of a series of seminal works on the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, including most recently Rousseau as author, Consecrating One's Life to the Truth. He's co-editor of the most scholarly, thorough, and readable English language edition of Rousseau's works by far, and to date. He's currently completing an extended study of Rousseau's early scientific writings. Finally, last but certainly not least, do you have the
No, sorry.
Michael Grieve is John G. Searle Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He co-founded and subsequently directed the Center for Individual Rights and has taught at Cornell, Johns Hopkins, and at Boston College. His books include, to cite a few, Real Federalism, Why It Matters, How It Could Happen, and The Upside Down Constitution, which will be published by Harvard University Press early in 2012. And I wish I could hold up the cover for you now, but I'm sure it will be an exciting work. I've asked each panelist to call it as he sees it, so what follows is not pre-planned. Each will speak for roughly 8 minutes, followed by discussion, first among the panelists, and then with the audience. The reception will follow beginning around 5:45. Again, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all.
Thanks very much, Professor Schell. It's a pleasure to be here. Professor Schell devoted one sentence in her introductory remarks to the question of ancient constitutionalism, and I'm going to expand that one sentence, which is exactly my thesis, but I'm going to expand it, that one sentence into 6 pages. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you get ahead in the academy. The topic assigned me, not really my choice, is Aristotle on constitutionalism. I should say to begin with, that it's not obvious that the political science of Aristotle was even concerned with what we call the constitution or constitutionalism. The key concept of Aristotle's political science, as Professor Professor Shell noted, is something called the politeia. And it's certainly true that this term has sometimes been translated as precisely constitution. For example, Aristotle's word for the constitution of the Athenians. But I think for us, constitution points to the fundamental and guiding law of the land, whether that law happens to be written or unwritten. And although Aristotle's political science certainly presents the majesty of law, at one point he goes so far as to say that the law is human intellect absent distorting human passion. Aristotle also presents no less clearly the essential inferiority of law to this thing called the politeia, which I would translate as the regime. The regime is the actual governing body in the community that calls the shots in broad daylight. The regime is therefore one or more human beings whose principal political task is the creation of those laws that it thinks are good or just. For Aristotle, then, the fundamental political phenomenon is not law at all, the regime, for the simple but decisive reason that all law is the creation of a given regime, a given set of human beings. And so if by constitutionalism we mean a law or a body of law, the study of that law, Aristotle's political science is not much concerned with it. Now, I might note in passing that today we're inclined to take law, constitutional law, as the fundamental political fact. I think on account of the very great stability of the regimes in the West. In the United States, for example, we take so much for granted the existence and the goodness of the liberal democratic regime that it's like oxygen. We depend on it, of course, but since it's everywhere around us, we hardly notice it. We tend to see instead only specific laws and debate their merits, or at the highest level, we may debate the proper interpretation of the Constitution, but not the fundamental goodness of the regime that produced it. And since stability is a precious political good, our concern with constitutionalism, to the neglect of the regime, in a sense, speaks well of our polity. Now, all of this may overstate somewhat the difference between what Aristotle meant by politeia and what we mean by constitutionalism. Both surely do speak to the organizing principle of political life, or embodied. Granted, in other words, that a specific regime formulated our Constitution, doesn't the Constitution reflect the nature of the regime? Surely this is the case. What then would Aristotle say about the American Constitution and the way of life that it gave rise to? This is a very long question, of course, and I'll limit myself to a few brief remarks. The most striking fact about the United States, at least from the point of view of the practice and theory of ancient republicanism, has to be its size. It is vast, the United States. And that is no accident, but central to its design, if you know Federalist 10, for example. Stability amidst liberty requires the multiplication of faction, and therefore a vast scale. Aristotle, by contrast, maintains that the best regime has to be, as he puts it, readily surveyable with the naked eye. Political life at its peak requires the direct involvement in governance of citizens, in ruling and being ruled in turn, as he puts it. And to allot offices on the basis of genuine merit, as opposed to picking names out of a hat, to give each his due, requires that you be familiar with the qualities of the characters of your fellow citizens. And you can't do that with 100,000 fellow citizens or 300 million. Now, the modest size of the ancient republic presupposes, in turn, a still more fundamental aim. If the goal of the modern republic, the US, is the protection of individual liberty, the goal of the ancient republic was living well or nobly or virtuously. To exaggerate, the modern republic seeks to guarantee the pursuit of happiness. The ancient one, the attainment of happiness. And happiness, as Aristotle presents it, is possible only through the cultivation of what he famously called moral virtue. The healthy regime, according to ancient political science, had as its first task the cultivation of moral virtue in the citizens. Liberty not guided by virtue amounts to license, so the older understanding went. Now, this centrality of moral virtue to Aristotle's science, political science, is connected with, oddly enough, his strange treatment of priests. On the one hand, Aristotle indicates clearly enough that the priesthood should be distinguished from the political offices, narrowly speaking. On the other hand, he lists priests as among those elements necessary to the existence of any community. Now, the way he lists the priests is revealing of the delicate balance he tries to strike in his political science. After enumerating first farmers, then artisans, then soldiers, and then the wealthy, he ranks those who are concerned with the divine as, quote, fifth and first. Fifth and first. The priests are only fifth in importance, and yet they have to also be called first, given the elevation of their concerns. Having inherited the view that the city was the creation of divine law and superintended by one or more gods, Apollo and Athena, Aristotle made famous the argument that the city is by nature, and we are by nature political animals. In doing that, he made possible a science of politics. And yet he refused to go so far as to banish the priests from political life altogether, or to relegate them to a strictly private sphere, as we say. He declined to take the steps necessary to transform political life in such a way as to permit a leading statesman to say, with Thomas Jefferson, that, quote, it does me no injury for my neighbor to say, there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. As for Aristotle's restraint in this regard, I believe he held that the moral virtue that has to be at the center of a healthy political life is sufficiently fragile, life itself is sufficiently fragile, as to require the support of the belief in a kind of providence. It's true that the sort of virtue Aristotle himself indicates is higher than moral virtue, what he calls contemplative virtue, doesn't seem to require that support of providence. But this is politically irrelevant. Political life can only imitate such virtue by pursuing, for example, the most peaceful foreign policy possible. In place of a conclusion, I want to return to my suggestion that the regime is necessarily more fundamental than the constitution or law. There is, however, one way for law to be more fundamental than the regime, if the laws in question come from a god or gods. Finally, in this case, they're not traceable to any group of human beings at all. The regime is then the organization of political life traceable to the wish or will of the divine. This is obviously not the path taken by the American founders. For whatever nature's God may mean, it ain't biblical God. And Aristotle's stress on the regime amounts to an implicit denial or denigration of the allegedly divine source of law. And it leads directly to this explicit critique of the laws of Apollo, the laws of the son of Zeus, Crete. Thank you.
I'm Robert Faulkner. I'm asked to talk about John Locke's constitutionalism, especially in relation to the American Constitution of 1788. And to do this in 8 minutes, I will talk very, very fast. Locke's version appeared about a century earlier than our Constitution in the second treatise on civil government. Civil government, in Locke's modern sense, is humane government. Government powerful enough, but also directed enough to secure human rights, which were then understood by Locke, by our founder, as natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Civil government calls for powers constituted, defined, and limited by fundamental law. So the American constitutionalists thought too. But there are important differences, not only as to federalism, which I won't speak about, but also as to the powers of the national government. The Locke is for the Americans. I'll talk about similarities first. A constitution is a compact establishing institutions of government. It is to be written, so Locke thought too. And it is fundamental. And thus it's a law. Why? Because it's established by consent of the majority, the one rightful authority for government. We the people, as Professor Shell said. A constitution then is not what the law professors tend to emphasize in our time. chiefly a Bill of Rights. Its establishment of the key means to protecting rights, government. Still, Locke plans not only government, as had Hobbes with his compact for one big artificial sovereign, but also separate powers of government and express limits upon the legislative power. Moreover, he would make the Constitution itself a political force, a binding law, not merely an original of government to be looked at as a plan. He proclaims that governmental powers are bound by the Constitution. He refrains from calling those powers sovereign, and he pricks up an enforcer and final authority, the people themselves. Locke even advertises in his closing chapter something no political philosopher had celebrated or advertised before, a right of rebellion, and in particular, a right of popular rebellion, a right of rebellion by majorities. People always had doubts about tyrants and about whether one could rebel against them, but thoughtful people spoke of those doubts very quietly. Locke speaks noisily. Locke, then, is the philosopher who constitutionalizes government and makes the Constitution itself part of a popular cause or creed, an ism. Constitutional government means, of course, that institutions govern, not a class or people as such. Locke spoke of commonwealth and republic, not democracy. Still, while Locke did not trust much the deep reasoning of most people, he trusted much less the domineering appetites of the wealthy and clever few. Hence his educating of the people toward an enlightened form of popular government. They might provide themselves to some extent for their real rights and interests through insisting on government by consent, rather democratic elections and prickly vigilance. This advocacy of popular self-government is complemented by Locke's advocacies of self-reliance in society. Children are to be brought up to shift for themselves. That's a phrase of Locke's. Then there is Locke's famous free enterprise society of competing strivers. that fosters and forces both self-reliance and a wealthy and powerful nation. It is the protection of such a society from majorities, yes, but chiefly from a narrow class that accounts for Locke's limitations on government. The legislative is to govern by established laws, not decrees or judicial decisions, and for the people as a whole, not some class. It is not to delegate its powers to some narrow group or to take a man's property without his consent or that of his representatives. Now, of course, this protection of property became fiercely controversial when this kind of society gave rise to great enterprises and capitalists. But Locke himself seemed mostly worried about exploitation not by a majority, but by a politically connected aristocracy. In its final form, this restriction was only this: one is not to be taxed without the consent of a majority of one's representatives. One reads through these restrictions, you see him move toward that conclusion. The Americans actually attempted somewhat more precise limitations on the federal government, of course, in good part because of their wish to leave sovereign power and leave big powers to the states. Now, despite appearances, Locke's arrangements of government seem somewhat more democratic than what the Americans planned. The biggest sign: no Senate. Locke favors a single assembly, not the two-house legislature that the Americans adopted. This is surprisingly unappreciated, and because, of course, Locke is writing under a regime or order that's very different from the one that he is, in fact, advocating. Whatever Locke's occasional mention of British arrangements, he is a bitter, if discreet, critic of hereditary aristocracy, and he never, in his own name, proposes a Montesquieuan Senate of the successor, to say nothing of a House of Lords. Instead, he presses surreptitiously toward rather democratic provisions for voting for this one assembly. We could say this one national assembly. Perhaps voting by even, quote, the meanest, unquote. Still, he would apportion representatives, that is to say, districts, by wealth as well as numbers, and he justifies this by contribution to the public weal. Wealth as well as numbers are important. As to the executive, Locke insists on a powerful executive that is enforcer of the laws, in charge of all foreign affairs, including peace and war, which he emphasizes cannot be regulated by law or international law, and able when necessary to act without law and even against the law. Constitutional popular government, we know, is to be effective government. And that requires especially executive power for dangerous exigencies, domestic as well as foreign, but not least foreign. Therefore, the notion that either Locke or our framers wanted a weak executive is in fact a big mistake. But his executive differs from the American in at least two major ways. First, and despite considerable toying with monarchy, Locke gradually moves his argument toward an executive chosen by the legislature, or at least with ministers subject to the legislature. And second, and even more quietly, Locke intimates that the executive may be partly or wholly plural, as in a modern cabinet. He moves toward control through legislative appointment, that is, as in what came to be known as parliamentary government. The Americans made the executive a largely independent and unitary power, our president, checked by a separate legislature and judiciary, with bits of executive power settled in the legislative branch. I mean, powers to approve treaties and declare war, for example, which were called even by Jefferson executive powers. And of course, bits of executive power, Locke would say, settled in our judiciary, which Locke tended to put under the head of executive powers. And that's my last topic. I want to add, by the way, that Professor Benegar and I have roughly some of the same topic on Locke, and whatever I say, he may in fact fiercely disagree. So you have that to look forward to. As to the judiciary, Locke certainly sets a familiar, if ambivalent, somewhat hidden role for judges. Judges are to apply the law impartially in particular cases and to protect, accordingly, individual liberties. This is, in a way, the liberal understanding. But, a very big but, Locke omits the judiciary as a separate and independent branch of government. Unlike Montesquieu and the Americans, his separation of powers then is simply, or essentially, between legislature and executive, not three powers. He certainly omits anything like judicial review, the power of our courts to construe the Constitution and enforce it on the other branches. Locke's liberal judges seem to be executive officials under legislative authority. Something like what I gathered to be here, this I don't know, the French system. Yes? Accordingly, Locke advertises the people themselves as authoritative interpreters and enforcers of the Constitution. He seemed to fear courts independent of the majority, for they could support an overpowerful executive, class privileges, or an elite's righteousness. But the people themselves, then, he gives them this important role. Majorities are the reliable way, he seemed to think, broadly speaking, to protect human rights. That doesn't mean the minorities won't be hurt, but broadly speaking, the people's rights will be protected more in this way. Nevertheless, the majority may be directed, or even superseded occasionally, by enlightened executives who understand the true plan of popular self-government. In our country, Thomas Jefferson's inaugurals are wonderful lessons in this kind of enlightened direction. Direction by enlightened people from behind the people, as voices of the people, so to speak. Locke says at one point, the safety of the people is the supreme law. It is Locke who is the decisive enlightener as to the fundamental law that serves as supreme law, the Constitution that serves popular self-government. In short, Locke's constitutionalism is that of an originalist, as we say today. He's not a living law guy. That is, he's not a believer in historically developing enlightenment and historically developing law. He set forth natural rights, the law of nature, and a natural public law somehow derived from man's natural right to provide for himself. Locke's original, nevertheless, his original constitution was rather more democratic, probably, than the American tradition. The greatest American Lockean was Jefferson at one of the stages. Okay? Not Washington or another different.
Before I came to school today, I looked up in my 1947 Webster dictionary, which we have inherited, the word constitutionalist. And after the two general definition 3 came in England, 1870, 1880, a conservative. Definition 4. In Spain and Mexico, a liberal. And unfortunately, there wasn't a fifth one in the United States. So I thought that for us, a constitutionalist has to be necessarily a conservative insofar as it requires attachment to something that we have inherited, and also necessarily a liberal because a constitutionalist is necessarily someone who respects the rule of law. So that's so at least in that sense, the two parties come together. As Professor Faulkner suggested, that our topic is the same. We both are going to talk about Locke, and I'm afraid to say I don't disagree with anything you said. But I will be I will be different from you in one respect. I will be more pedantic and more abstract. and in particular, I have 6 points that I will make, and hopefully